have banned pupils from playing outside as a precaution. The poor air quality affecting parts of England and Wales is being blamed on dust from the Sahara as well as pollution from the continent. LBC senior reporter Tom Swarbrick has more.
With conditions not set to improve until tomorrow, precautions are being taken. Some school children are being kept indoors. These parents think it's a good idea.
I think it's necessary. I think it's fair enough, really, yeah.
Yeah, you would worry, especially as there's loads of kids with breathing conditions, asthma's on the rise.
The elderly and those with respiratory problems are also being told to limit the time they spend outside.
Supporters of a teenage asylum seeker who was deported last night say they'll fight to get her back into the UK. Yashika Bhagirathi was put onto an Air Mauritius flight from Heathrow after a last-minute legal attempt to stop her removal failed. President Obama says he's heartbroken after another shooting at an army base in America where 13 people were killed a few years ago. This time, 4 people have died at Fort Hood in Texas, including the gunman who was a serving soldier with mental health issues. England's chief school inspector says children should start classes from the age of 2. Ofsted's Sir Michael Wilshaw wants to see a radical overhaul of nursery education to help children get the best start. And the Deputy Prime Minister's weekly radio show here on LBC has been nominated twice in the UK radio industry's biggest awards ceremony. Clegg is up for Best Speech Show as well as Best News Programme. Nick Ferrari is also nominated for Breakfast Show of the Year and Best Speech Radio Personality, and LBC's up for Station of the Year at the Radio Academy Awards next month. At 8:45, the FTSE was up 9 at 66.67. LBC weather, a misty start with sunny spells then developing for London and the South East, becoming cloudy later with a chance of showers. Highs of 18 degrees, remaining dull and cool in the northeast of the UK. LBC News Time, it's 8:59.
Left a bit. Almost. Bit more.
Oh, come on, what are you doing?
There's a branch in the way.
You're getting a bit heavy.
Tiny bit more. Almost. Got it.
All that for a bit of fruit.
Yeah.
Fruit's fun when it's free, which is why we're giving away a fruit bag with every Happy Meal bought on the first Friday of each month. This Friday, get a free apple and grape fruit bag. Free Fruit Fridays from McDonald's. After 10:30am, subject to availability, participating restaurants.
This is LBC. Call Clegg. Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg takes your calls with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. 0845 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Leading Britain's conversation. This is Call Clegg on LBC.
It's 9 o'clock on Thursday, the 3rd of April, and that means it's time for Call Clegg with me, Nick Clegg, here on LBC. I'll be taking your questions for the next half an hour, so do get involved. You can call on 0845 6060 973. Email at nickclegg@lbc.co.uk, and of course you can watch on the website lbc.co.uk. But before we get started, can I congratulate you, Nick Ferrari, because I think you've been nominated. I just heard on the headlines for 2 honours in the Radio Academy Awards.
Well, that's very kind, and I have to say, Mr. Clegg, Deputy Prime Minister, you have 2. You've been nominated for Call Clegg for Best Speech.
Double celebration of the night.
You could do with some good.
The 2 Nicks.
You could do with some good news, Mr. Clegg. The Best Speech Programme and Best News and Current Affairs Programme. Seeing as it took me about 6 years to even get a nomination, and you've been at it about half an hour. You obviously show considerable prowess.
Right, well, fingers crossed.
Could be the next career, Mr. Clegg. Not that I'm suggesting anything.
No, thank you.
Indeed.
Right.
It's Call Clegg with Nick Clegg. Go ahead, sir.
First call, Karen in West Lothian. Hello, Karen.
Morning, and well done last night.
Thank you, Karen.
I'm amused by David Cameron making out this morning that he's somehow the voice of reason on Europe when he wants to reform it by getting rid of our hard-won employment rights before having a referendum. My question to you is, although you're a very powerful advocate for the EU, you also acknowledge that it isn't perfect. What 3 things would you do to make it better?
Karen, I think you're quite right. Of course, the European Union is not perfect, and as we saw in the debate yesterday between myself and Nigel Farage, there were lots of people who really don't like it, want to get rid of it, want to get out of it, and so on. I've always said that you've got to reform it, but to reform it, you've got to be in it and to lead it. I think the things I'd single out are more trade. I think there's a whole lot more stuff that we can do to open up trade so that businesses in our country can trade elsewhere in the European Union, elsewhere in the world. That creates jobs. I think less bureaucracy, to be honest. I remember when I was a member of the European Parliament, for instance, you have to trek down to Strasbourg from Brussels every month for the cost of 150 million quid a year. I think it was we should just scrap this bureaucracy in Strasbourg and just keep everybody in one place. That would save money, and I think less red tape. So, for instance, Ed Davey, a colleague of mine in government, very, very good Liberal Democrat Secretary of State, he, for instance, for the first time ever negotiated within the European Union an exemption, a moratorium on new red tape being placed on the shoulders of small businesses. So more trade, less bureaucracy, less red tape would be my rule of thumb, Karen.
Didn't you once say it took 12 years to discuss chocolate and how
15. 15. No, you're quite right. You're quite right. When I worked years ago in Europe, I remember that it took a decade and a half for the European Union to decide on a chocolate directive. And I remember thinking at the time, firstly, how ridiculous it is. It takes a decade and a half to sort of decide on a definition of chocolate, but also it made me think this is hardly some monstrous superstate if it takes that long to even decide what sweet sugary chocolate is. But there you go,
Karen, your reaction.
Yeah, I think that's very right. And the only thing that I'd say about chocolate is we just need more of it.
Nice. I'm surrounded by broadcasters. I'm lucky to be clinging to my job. Karen, you're a natural as well. Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister, we move on.
James in Regent's Park. Hello, James.
Morning. I wanted to ask you the question, why do you think we should be putting sanctions on Putin when he's actually probably prevented a civil war in the Ukraine?
Because I think he has annexed another, a chunk of another country, and
even when he has a military base in the country, and that was going to be taken away from him in 2017.
Yes, I don't think the presence of the Russian fleet in Sevastopol in Crimea is sufficient reason to say that therefore Russia can, with impunity, in effect.
James, I will come back to you. Let's just hear a little bit more from Mr. Clegg, Deputy Prime Minister.
No, that's it, James. I think in this day and age, in the 21st century, in the heart of Europe, countries should respect each other's territorial integrity, whatever the history, whatever the culture, whatever the ethnic and linguistic links, whatever the military bases. You can't go around just simply barging into other countries and just saying, well, we're just going to nick a whole chunk of your territory. And of course I've always acknowledged it. Everybody acknowledges.
What about the history and the military struggle against the Nazis there? Do you take any history from that? Any lessons from history?
As I say, regardless of the history, and as you know, Crimea was transferred from the Soviet Union, what was then the Soviet Union, to Ukraine by Khrushchev. Whatever the history is, I just don't think in this day and age we can sort of sit idly by while one country, in effect, annexes chunks of another. It is as simple as that. If you were to start doing that, just imagine what's going to happen across the Balkans, across the Caucasus, if people start saying, well, you know what, we feel like occupying a chunk of our neighbours because we feel like it and because we've got some historical claim, or because there's a community there that speaks the same language as us. There is one of the building blocks of the international rule of law is that people respect each other's territorial integrity, other than in exceptional circumstances. And I think in these circumstances it wasn't justified for Russia to do what they've done.
All right, James, thank you for that. We move on.
Phil in Watford. Hello, Phil.
Good morning, Nick. Commiserations for last night. I heard the debate, and I don't think you did come off better on that, and I think that's backed up by the press. But my question's not about that.
I enjoyed it, Phil. But anyway, there you go. Right.
Well, your idea of enjoyment might be different.
That's maybe true.
We might not wish to pry too deeply into these areas then. On we go with your question, Phil.
Right. I believe that Vince Cable is going to become one of the longest-serving business secretaries, certainly in the last 50 years, at the weekend.
Weekend after next, he overtakes Patricia Hewitt. We have to go back to 1957. I can't remember the gentleman's name, someone Thornycroft, and I'm ashamed to say who it was. But yes, that is the Vince Cable will attain that post. On you go, Phil.
Well, I was just going to ask why you think he's still business secretary after such a debacle with the Royal Mail privatisation, and also with some of the things he said in the past, such as his fighting against Murdoch and just his qualifications to have anything to do with business, to be honest.
Well, I strongly disagree with you, Phil. I think if you look at what Vince has done, I'll come to the Royal Mail point in a minute, by the way, which I totally understand is a controversial one, but I think if you look at what Vince has done to introduce the greatest expansion, the most significant expansion of apprenticeships that our country has seen probably in the post-war period. If you look at the huge backing he's given to manufacturing, no business secretary in living memory has given so much backing to manufacturing through the tax breaks, the intellectual property rules that we've provided to manufacturers. We've set up these new centres where universities and manufacturers come together. There's one in my neck of the woods in South Yorkshire. So I think he's really stood up for Britain's ability to rediscover our self-confidence, that we can invent things, design things, manufacture things and export things. And that is, I think, a tremendous contribution to the rebalancing of the British economy, which is so important. On Royal Mail, as Vince said the other day in the House of Commons, his first and foremost duty was to make sure that the Royal Mail is safely privatised, that the universal provision of the delivery of letters and parcels across the country is safeguarded, and that it becomes a stable, profitable business in the long run, so that we taxpayers are not shelling out millions and millions of pounds to bail it out, which was the pattern in the past. Of course, how share prices go up and down is an unpredictable thing, but I think he was quite right in saying unapologetically that the core objectives that he had been asked to deliver in this privatisation were achieved.
Phil?
I was just going to say, I think it misses a key point, which is value for money. The people of this country, through the government, owned the Royal Mail. And in fact, I must thank you and Vince, because I made £500 out of that. Thank you very much, because the shares just went up so much. But I think that overall, the government has lost £1 billion on the share privatisation.
Well, Phil,
I don't think that gives... Well, if you think about it, it raised £2 billion. I've read it up... the facts up, and you reckon there's £1.5 billion left in value in the Royal Mail, and you're sort of crowing about that. It's crowing about the fact that the share price has gone up and it's now worth £1.5 billion.
Well, Phil, sorry.
Roughly a third of... Hold on. Just for roughly a third of shares, which means that 2/3 of shares should have raised £3 billion, not 2. Now, I do appreciate that if the government's doing a privatisation, they can't sell at full price because people just wouldn't buy it. There has to be some sort of discount, but a discount where I'm making 70% on my shares... I think that's really not done a good job for this country.
Sure,
not done. But Phil,
can I hear what you say? But can I just put the rival point of view, which is that you say value for money. What was not value for money was that you and all the taxpayers across the country in the past had to dig deep into your pockets to subsidise a failing state-owned Royal Mail, which was costing us hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds over time. The fact that this government, unlike any previous government, has said, no, we're not going to ask you to do that because it's poor value for money for taxpayers constantly to subsidise an organisation which can stand on its own 2 feet. And successfully do so, give thousands of people who work in Royal Mail a stake, which, by the way, is someone who's been a long-standing leading advocate of what I call a sort of John Lewis-style economy, where more people, more employees have a stake in the businesses in which they work. I think all of those things are actually very, in the long term, Phil, I would argue, in the long term, show that we are protecting value for money for the taxpayer by making sure the taxpayer isn't constantly having to cross-subsidise Royal Mail.
Just lastly on this, Phil, thank you for your call. Chuka Umunna, who is Vince Cable's shadow, has described it as a first-class disaster. You could argue, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But even the National Audit Office, Mr. Clegg, says too much emphasis was put on rushing the sale at the expense of value for money. The nation could have lost up to about £1 billion, 70% increase in the value of the shares since the sale price, and you're still saying Dr. Cable did a good job?
Well, if you actually read the National Audit Office report, they say something slightly different in the sense they say, look, there was too much caution. That's the word they use, that it was too cautious. And I think what Vince has explained is he accepts that caution was right in order to ensure that the transfer of this very big organisation, which has had a very troubled past, which has cost the taxpayer hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds over a long period of time, should be done sensibly and, yes, cautiously, in a way that doesn't incur further risks. Now, clearly it is a matter of opinion whether you think the caution to get this right is justified in the long run. Vince believes, the Prime Minister believes, I believe in the long run that it was done in the right way.
2 or 3 callers have already mentioned the debate last night, and of course you were in the LBC debate the week before that.
Indeed. It was Ferrari versus Dimbleby. One could say. Well, I don't want to intrude on...
I know I'm back on that one without a shadow of a doubt. Why do you suppose you lost both debates?
Oh, I think, listen, going into this debate, when I first challenged Nigel Farage, I was acutely aware of the fact that, firstly, I am making an argument that hasn't been heard for 20 years. You know, for 20 years, people like Nigel Farage and others have been merrily going around saying stuff, often totally fictional stuff, about our membership of the European Union, which just hasn't been challenged. So I'm not going to reverse 20 years of myth-making in 2 hours. And also, you know, Nigel Farage has a few very simple propositions which are understandably very attractive to people when many people are quite fearful and anxious about what's going on in the modern world. So when he says, we don't need to get entangled with problems elsewhere in the world. We don't need to allow any immigrants to come to this country. We can sort of do everything on our own. We can, disentangle ourselves from Europe. I totally understand why people go, that's what I want. That doesn't mean, however, that I should stop from arguing what I believe to be right for the country in the long run. And I totally accept that what I might say might not be popular, clearly, as the polls have indicated overnight.
How bruised do you feel?
Oh, I don't feel bruised at all. I'm delighted we've had this debate because...
But you haven't... Well, you accept that it would appear... Well, wouldn't appear. The LBC won 57 plays 36 in favour of Mr Farage. Last night, 69 plays 31. Actually, more than double your score. You took a trouncing. You took a beating last night, didn't you?
No, I'm absolutely delighted we have this debate. The debate has now finally started. So, these were 2 hours of a debate which will now go on month in, month out. And as I say, David Cameron and Ed Miliband don't want to have this debate. They don't have the courage to actually say what they think. At least I have the courage to get up and say, this is what I believe, even though I know what I'm saying is not popular. I understand it's not popular to say, look, in the modern world, the idea that we can somehow say that people can't come to this country from elsewhere in the European Union to work, I understand that's not a popular thing to say these days. I understand, given all the myth-making around the European Union over the last 20 years, it's quite a challenge to contest those myths and those settled preconceptions. But I'm delighted that the debate has started because, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and this is the start of a long debate, and I will continue to say what I believe in, regardless of whether, this poll or that poll agrees with me or not.
How do you rate Nigel Farage as a bloke and as a debater?
I think he's a good debater, and he's got good, sort of straightforward lines which say, look, don't worry, the complexities of all of the world, we can just get rid of it all by just saying, to hell with the rest of the world. We're not going to be part of Europe. We're not going to bother about conflicts in Syria. We're not going to bother about conflicts in Ukraine. I understand that at a time of, and by the way, this is a phenomenon politically that you're seeing not just here in UKIP, but you're seeing it in Holland, in France, in Italy. There are people, there are populists from left and from right who are saying to people that the complexities of the modern world can all be solved by turning our backs on the modern world. And I understand that's attractive, but I fervently disagree with it. And I'm not going to stop explaining what I believe in because I think it's so important for the long-term benefit of the country. Because otherwise what you do is you end up just basically sitting on your hands like the other party leaders are doing. And I think that really is a pretty weak thing to do.
And if your life depended on having a pint with either him or David Cameron, with whom would you drink your pint?
I have plenty of friends, thankfully, outside politics to have pints with, and they're the people I'll have a pint with.
And just lastly with David Cameron on this, is this now a red line? Come 2015, if there were talks about a repeat of the coalition, which of course you will point to has achieved so much in the years that you've been in power.
Indeed.
How much would the red line be, the idea of an EU renegotiation that David Cameron is so keen on?
Well, I think David Cameron's renegotiation, I still don't quite understand what it's supposed to be all about.
So it's a red line come 2015?
To be honest, I think the more I've heard about, or at least what I've read in the newspapers about the Conservative plans, it's a little tweak here, it's a little tweak there. I don't think it'll satisfy anybody within the Conservative Party, many of whom actually agree with Nigel Farage that they want to leave the European Union altogether. That's why, frankly, regardless of what you think about this debate, at least there was an honest debate last night between two people who have very different but clear views.
So it's not a bump in the road come 2015?
Well, as I say, I talked to Karen earlier, who was asking about should we reform the European Union. I believe in reform. What I don't believe is a realistic prospect is to kind of do what I think David Cameron initially suggested, which is to repatriate a bunch of powers. In other words, to say we'll only keep the good bits, but we'll let everybody else in the European Union keep the bad bits. I've never thought that's a realistic proposition.
We must move on to other calls. Mr. Clegg.
Phil.
Sorry,
I'm repeating. Shirley in Beckenham. Sorry, Shirley. I wasn't going to call you Phil. That was.
Yes. Good morning, Mr. Clegg. Yes, at the last election, the Conservatives had a pledge to raise the inheritance tax threshold to £1 million. Mm-hmm. Now, I suppose because of the coalition afterwards, it never happened. And I actually wrote letters recently, which one of them arrived on the Osborne's desk, and I've had a reply from the minister concerned, Mr. Gawke, but because in the press the last few days, they've been saying that at this election they are considering raising the threshold again to £1 million. But in this letter I had from Mr. Gawke, he said it wasn't to be until 2018, which I think is actually a bit of a snidey thing to do, because with inflation and the value of properties increasing and everything, the extra 3 years of waiting for it, the government's going to raise a hell of a lot of extra revenue, whereas we, as the electorate, want to have it happen, if they're going to do it at the next election, pretty immediately, because it affects a lot of us, particularly if we're older. I'm 80 and I've got a large family.
Indeed, Shelley. Stay on the line. We'll come back to you in a second. You're not a fan of cuts in inheritance tax, are you?
Oh, look, I've actually, as it happens, I've got no problem with the way that you constantly have to look at the threshold at where inheritance tax...
325 at the moment.
But let me explain. And Shirley, you've raised a really important issue, which is what do we do as a country when there's very little money around? And by the way, whoever's in government next, you were talking, Shirley, about the letter you've received from Mr. Gawke about what the Conservative plans are if they were to be in government next. Whoever's in government next is not going to have very much money to spend. So you can't spend money on everything. You can't give everybody the tax cuts you want, so you have to choose. And this is where there is a bit of a difference of opinion, which is that my choice has been, and my party's choice has been, and this will remain our priority, is that the money that is available to deliver tax cuts, the priority should remain on lowering the income tax burden on millions and millions of people on ordinary incomes in this country. And that's why, as you know, Shirley, I'm proud as punch that we have lifted, as of this weekend, the point at which you start paying income tax to £10,000, and as of next April it'll be £10,500. That's an expensive thing to do, though. It's one of the biggest changes in the personal income tax system, and that's where my priority lies. Now, the Conservative Party, you're quite right, have said in the past that they want to prioritise and said changes in inheritance tax. Now, inheritance tax, actually about 4% of estates in our country pay inheritance tax. So the vast majority of estates...
You sure of that figure?
Yeah, it's about 4%.
I have a different
So now, of course, that might change, depending on what you do with the threshold, depending on property prices. And as you know, the Conservatives, in my view, Shirley, they've become sort of tax chameleons. They keep changing their colours. One moment it's inheritance tax, then they wanted to change the top rate of tax, then they wanted to give tax breaks for people to give up their employment rights for shares, then they wanted a marriage tax break. I just think it's important that, given that we don't have very much money, given we have to prioritise some tax cuts over others, I believe that the absolute priority should remain putting money back in the pockets of millions of working people.
So you don't support going up to... It's currently $325,000. The idea it should go up to $1 million. You simply don't support it. I don't think it should be the second highest rate in the world.
As I say, I don't think it should be our priority. It's not to say at all that if money was no object, we had pots of gold, you can't look at this kind of thing, as you can look at many other tax changes. But I just think to govern is to choose, and you certainly have to choose, and you certainly have to single out your priorities when there isn't very much money left. And as I say, at the moment, of course, Shirley's quite right to say this may or may not change. At the moment, the vast majority of estates in this country don't pay inheritance tax.
And yet you're a great fan of Europe, where the average is £1.8 million.
No. This is, sorry to interrupt, Nick. I've heard this deeply misleading, because actually the way in which wealth and assets are transferred from one generation to the next in Europe is very, very different to our inheritance tax system. I mean, other countries actually.
Well, you quite like the United States. It's £3.2 million there, I read, and it's $325,000 in the UK. I mean, goodness me, that's hardly a conservatory in London.
Well, as I say, about 4% of the total estates in this country pay inheritance inheritance tax at the moment, so 95%, just over that, do not. Of course, we can look at this, always look at this, but it's a question of priorities, and my priority is to give people tax cuts on low and middle incomes, and it will remain my priority.
Shirley, thank you. You heard the answer. We move on to other calls.
Kathy in Blackheath, Nick Ferrari country, I think. Hello, Kathy.
Yes.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
I was waiting for the day when we would see the cracks appearing in the national health system. What I find diabolical, and absolutely, I'm absolutely seething. The fact being that they want to charge £10 a month for more national health to put into the system. And I think, when I say the cracks are appearing, it's because we have this open door immigration, and we're propping up now, and it's failing the NSH. It cannot cope. And the infrastructure that surrounds everything else regarding housing, schools, roads, transport. Answer me, Mr. Clegg. How are we going to get above this? Please tell me. You're so insistent on staying in the EU.
A couple of issues. Stay on the line. We've got this is a suggestion from the Lord Warner review, a former Labour health minister. Patients should be charged £10 a month to use the NHS, possibly even £20 a night to stay in a hospital. And then we also have the aspect of people coming into the country. Two issues, Mr. Clegg.
Kathy, firstly, this idea I think is a nonsense idea. I don't agree with it. I'm completely with you, Kathy. This idea from a former Labour health minister that we all get changed. I think they even bizarrely called it a membership fee or something.
Yes,
I think is a totally daft idea, and it's not something I support at all, because the NHS, you're quite right, Kathy, should remain free at the point of use, not based on need, not on the ability to pay. On the couple of other things that you've raised, I think you're right, Kathy, that we need to make sure that those people who come to this country who should make a contribution to how the NHS is funded should do so, and that's why we're actually introducing, it's controversial, some people object to it, but we're actually introducing a new charging system so that people from outside the European Union, for instance, who come to this country, when they get their visas, they also pay a sum. I think it's about £200 or so, which goes towards the NHS, because you're quite right. We do need to make sure that the burden, it's the National Health Service, it's not an international health service. And on your point about people moving in and out of Europe, I mean, you're clearly one of the people who disagrees with me, Kathy, but as I pointed out in the debate with Nigel Farage yesterday, since 2004, which was when the kind of restrictions on some of the new EU member states was lifted in our country, about 1.5 million people from elsewhere in the European Union have come to our country. About half of them have gone back home, and there are about 1.5 million Brits who are living and working elsewhere in the European Union. So it is a bit of a two-way street. About 1.5 million who've come here, 1.5 million Brits who are elsewhere, since 2004. And I think, for all the reasons that Nigel Farage and I argued about yesterday, I think that is something that freedom to be able to move to other European countries, which many Brits also exploit, is something that we should seek to protect.
All right, let's do some email questions I must get in, please. This one comes from Pierre in Kent. How come it took more than a decade to get Abu Qatada out of the country, yet we seem to have deported a Mauritian student almost overnight? I think this refers to the case, Deputy Prime Minister, you might be aware, Yashika Begharati, who was finally deported last night. In the face of it, has to be said, considerable opposition. Mr. Clegg.
The reason why it took so long to deport Abu Qatada, it did take far too long, and it was very frustrating for me, frustrating for everybody. We're thankfully now changing the rules a bit to make it easier.
Well, certainly in Yashika's case, she's gone almost overnight.
Well, in Yashika's case, and of course, look, I'm like everybody else. You see this young woman, she's obviously a lovely person, she's obviously a hard-working student. I totally understand why people say, well, why are we saying that she can't have asylum here? It is important to remember that the way which asylum works is that if someone comes here, or a family comes here, which is the case in Yashika's instance, and say, look, we're fleeing persecution, we want to live here instead, we have every right as a country to say, OK, we will look at that and we'll give you refuge, asylum, if your claims are right, if they stand up to scrutiny. If not, I'm afraid, sorry, no, you need to go back home. And that's not an unreasonable principle of the asylum system. And in Yashika's
would it really have hurt one schoolgirl? Would it really have hurt?
The thing is, the problem is, if the moment you say, however much I might have liked the way Yashika clearly
Committed
the way she
girl,
appears to
yeah.
Yes, no, I understand
Young
that.
woman, I should
but
say,
you know,
sorry.
it is nonetheless right to say, look, you can't just say, well, because she's a good student, which she clearly is, given that this has been through lots and lots of examinations, lots of appeals, lots of reviews. She's 19, by the way. That's why she's going back to Mauritius now. The Mauritians have given us very clear reassurances that nothing will happen to her. She's got younger brothers and sisters. They will also, of course, be returned to Mauritius under this decision. I understand the strength of feeling. Of course, you feel as a human being something for her as an individual, but on the other hand, we just have to make, we do have to defend our right as a country to say we have every right, like every country around the world does, to scrutinise the claims that people make about why they've come to our country to seek refuge in the first place.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you. David Cameron has heaped praise on Waitrose. He says the customers are, quotes, more talkative and engaged. He's regularly asked questions when he walks around the aisles. That's where he feels most comfortable, although he does use Sainsbury's at Chipping Norton because, quotes, there isn't a Waitrose. Which supermarkets do you use, and do the customers engage with you, and do you enjoy it?
I do. I use a fair number of supermarkets. I haven't yet, unlike the Prime Minister, discerned a huge amount of difference between one.
Are you welcomed or reviled across all of them?
No, I actually, as it happens, Nick, people regularly come and chat to me, or there's a lot of people want to take selfies these days, so I think I'm appearing, I'm afraid, as some grinning idiot on a large number of selfies in various supermarkets. In South West London.
But do you notice
that
a Waitrose customer is more discerning than an Aldi customer, or Asda plays stronger than a Tesco? Or
no, I've shopped in. In the last few weeks. I've shopped in Asda, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, and Tesco. So there you go. I've done the full spread, and at the moment, I will do further market research. I haven't discerned any great difference.
All right, we've got time for one quick question.
Yes, Jonathan in Wendover. Hello, Jonathan.
Jonathan, have we got you quickly? If not, the question is going to be from me, so it is my question. How are you coping with the fog or the smog? Are you worried about your children, and what can be done? Obviously, we can't blame the government for this, but what can be done? What precautions must people take?
I think everyone just needs to be a bit careful. I think particularly the very young, the very old, listen carefully to what the health professionals are saying. Look out for the weather forecast. Clearly, it depends quite a lot on different areas of the country.
It's pretty bad in central London today.
Yeah, no. I was noticing, I was walking my kids to school yesterday, and I was just showing the kids this brown sort of film on the cars. My youngest boy, as it happens, was up most of the night. That's why I probably look a bit bleary-eyed, because he was coughing all night. I don't know whether that's associated with it, but I just think people particularly who are susceptible to lung conditions really do need to be careful. And I think the weather forecast says that they hope this will literally blow over fairly soon, and until it does, I just
what about the tennis? So you've been playing any tennis in this?
No, I haven't. I've been focusing on...
And is the Prime Minister hat sounded wind and limb?
I've no idea. I've been focusing on a different game of back and forth with Nigel Farage.
All right, well done on that. Congratulations again for your nominations in those two radio awards. Thank you. Call Clegg here with the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. We take a week off next week. We shall return after that. You're listening to LBC.
Good morning, I'm Lisa Aziz. Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg has told LBC